Look at this beautiful country, a picturesque island nation, so inspiring, so progressive. Did you know they're about to vote on whether or not to legalize a drug that has been illegal for over 70 years? Some members of parliament called it a threat to society, especially to young people and manual workers. Others, they call it the gateway drug, the one that's going to get you into stronger, more harmful drugs. Who would think they would make such a fuss about legalizing beer?
Beer. Sparkling, golden, pure, refreshing.
Of course, the island nation in question is Iceland, and the year was 1988. That's right, up until then, it was illegal to sell, consume, or produce beer. On May that year, beer prohibition was finally abolished by Parliament, and the new law allowing beer sales took effect in March 1989. Society continued to function. Well, sort of, in an Icelandic way. So what did Iceland lawmakers see in beers that we missed?
Hey guys, what you doing, drugs?
Alcohol isn't a drug. Just don't you know anything?
Why was it such a threat to them?
When you're under the influence of alcohol, you keep on trying.
And why, 3 decades later, we can see the same attitude towards cannabis in New Zealand.
Well, I don't like the increase of drug use, particularly for the sort of 18 to 24-year-olds. I think there's a whole lot of unknown answers to questions, and I simply wish we were waiting a little bit longer so we could see more of that evidence coming through.
Well, lucky for us, Paula, both cannabis and alcohol has been consumed for millennia, and there is a lot of evidence out there.
A drug is any chemical substance that changes our mind or body.
Why don't we have a look on what the Global Commission on Drug Policy has to say about it?
The story you are about to see involves some facts about physiology, but it is more than a clinical report.
20 substances were compared based on the harms they inflict on both the user and the community, in aspects ranging from drug-specific mortality and dependence to crime and economic costs. The modeling showed that heroin, crack cocaine, and methamphetamine were the most harmful drugs to individuals, whereas alcohol, heroin, and crack cocaine were the most harmful to others. Overall, alcohol was the most harmful drug, with heroin and crack cocaine in second and third places. Cannabis received a harm score of 20, placing it way below alcohol and tobacco. So scientifically speaking, Iceland had more reason to be concerned about legalizing beer than we do about cannabis. But when it comes to justifying prohibitions, science must be excused to give way to something much more unscientific. Culture, that is.
I've been finding out about booze and pot, and it looks like you're losing the battle.
What battle?
Prohibition is much more of an outcome of conflict between different societal groups than a way to shelter the public from the harms of drug consumption. In early 20th century Iceland, drinking alcohol was associated with a Danish lifestyle. Prohibition started at a time that Icelanders were struggling to gain their independence from Denmark, and banning alcohol served as a symbolic role in the movement for self-determination. In New Zealand, the Opium Prohibition Act of 1901 contained our first drug prohibition policy, and it was directed primarily at Chinese immigrants. The law was clearly discriminatory and revoked the rights of a Chinese person to lawfully buy opium, while other people were free to do so. Indian hemp, that's early 20th century for cannabis, had been regulated in New Zealand since 1927. However, it wasn't until 1964 that it was made illegal following the UN Single Conventions on Narcotic Drugs. The convention was rooted in US prohibition policies, which later led to the War on Drugs in 1971.
Launched an all-out offensive against crime, against narcotics, against permissiveness in our country.
A few decades later, John Ehrlichman, one of President Nixon's lead domestic affairs advisors, revealed these policies had nothing to do with drugs.
We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities.
So while the alcohol ban in Iceland was mostly a patriotic act of independence, cannabis prohibition in New Zealand was, well, the opposite? It welcomed US cultural imperialism into our domestic politics. Decades later, prohibition has proven not only ineffective in stopping drugs usage, but also a major contributor to multiple negative social consequences, as intended by the Nixon administration and recently reported by the Helen Clark Foundation. The Foundation report points out our current policy is not only harmful to our health, but also to equity. The criminal justice disparities impacting on Māori are stark. What this means is that in a population where the vast majority of New Zealanders at some point use cannabis, Māori are more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested and convicted for minor drug offences than non-Māori. Most of us think we're voting for or against cannabis, but regardless of the result of that referendum, cannabis will still be here, as easily accessible as a pint in Reykjavik in 1987. The referendum is not asking voters if they agree with smoking weed or if they think it's a good or a bad thing. But rather, it's focused on people's rights to access cannabis safely and reduce the harmful behaviors currently associated with prohibition. The real question the referendum is asking is, do you think we should acknowledge our unique cultural context, uphold our treaty obligations, and rid our nations of outdated policies inherited from a backwards American president?